Hello, everybody. My name is Graham Salinger, founder and president of Salinger Coaching Solutions. And this is my first episode of PEP, which stands for Passion, Empowerment, and Perseverance. And on this show, I talk to my guests about ways they have a pep in their step. In other words, ways in which they've been empowered throughout their life, but also ways in which they put a pep in other people's step, ways that they've been empowering for other people throughout their careers. And today I have the great honor of talking to Tina Kocol. She is a career facilitator with over a decade of experience facilitating groups on topics ranging from grief, addiction, trauma-informed nonviolent conflict resolution, resiliency, and interrupting hate. She holds 2 master's degrees from Arcadia University, one in mental health counseling and one in international peace and conflict resolution. And she has a BA in community leadership, nonprofit management, and psychology. Tina also recently started her own private practice called Green Circle, which focuses on helping people build better relationships by offering therapy, relationship coaching, and facilitated workshops. Welcome to the program, Tina.
Thank you for having me, Graham. I'm so excited to be your first guest. I feel so special. It's such an auspicious occasion.
Great. So, let's get into it. One of the things that I draw upon in my coaching is the importance of people's stories, how they have lived their lives, and how they would like to continue to live their lives. So can you kind of tell us, you have a very diverse background in terms of the types of facilitation and empowerment work that you've done. What about your personal narrative has led you to this work?
I think you really hit the nail on the head when it comes to the idea of storytelling as sort of an art, but also there's a science behind it as well, and kind of learning the arc of story and where sort of people are in their own narrative. Are they just figuring out that there's a problem? Are they at a crescendo moment? Are they at sort of a decision-making point? And really helping people identify where their narrative is in their own story or how they're relating in other people's stories has always been really fascinating to me. And I always remember growing up when it came to storytelling in movies or TV shows or things like that, it was never the lead characters that I thought were the most interesting. It was always sort of like the quirky best friend or the wise old neighbor or something like that. The people that had kind of more depth behind them and really I just feel so curious about those people's stories. And I find so often that in mainstream culture, those stories aren't told as much. And so really trying to find ways to hear those stories or find people who are willing to tell those stories has always been kind of a personal passion and mission of mine. And have their stories be told is just as important as sort of those main characters that I never found as interesting.
Very interesting. And so when you think about your ability to empower people to share their experience, to come to the realization of where they are in a process of the work they have to do, one of the things that I focus on in my service in terms of empowering clients, and you obviously, like I said, have a very diverse amount of ways in which you do that. What are ways that you empower your clients to go through that process, to both find their own story and then sort of generally just to be empowered to take the right actions to go from where they want to be from where they are to where they want to be?
Yeah, I mean, it's such a good question. Thank you for asking that. From like a mental health counselor standpoint, a lot of empowerment has to do with giving people an opportunity to own their truth and to not necessarily fit their life or their belief system or their style, whatever it is, into maybe a template that doesn't serve them or fit them, whatever that storyline may be. Oftentimes it's helping people almost kind of reimagine or think sort of outside maybe the template. I keep using the word template, but really, yeah, like whatever the timeline or template or whatever narrative that they think they should, it's really kind of peeling back what those beliefs about what should be, and then have them embrace what actually is and then what they want to do. Because when you can kind of peel back the shoulds, you can begin to identify like what are the real values that are driving what I'm doing. A lot of the work that I do with people is values-based relationship work, and to really help people identify what values are they living out and that are most important for them to live out, but then also how do they want to live out those values? Because I can value the same thing as you, but we can have very different ways of exploring what that value looks like in each of our lives. So yeah, that's sort of how I start. And then from there, it's always a wild journey for sure.
Yeah, I heard two really important things that I sort of want to extract from that. Is you sort of talk about a lot of people have beliefs, or they're socialized to certain beliefs, but sometimes those beliefs can be limiting, right? We have limiting belief systems, and our job as coaches and facilitators and people who work in transforming people's lives and empowerment are to expand that pot away from the limiting beliefs into expanding and empowerment beliefs. And I also heard you talk that part of that is about not only having values, but also having those values be pushed and motivated. Mm-hmm. And so, yeah, can you speak a little bit about, in your experience, what has worked, and what are some challenges that you faced, and what has worked well in terms of helping people negotiate their belief and value systems so they can commit to actions that are empowering for them?
Yeah, I think it's really hard to commit to action if you're afraid of a negative consequence, or if you're afraid of failure, or if you're fear driven, you will end up being paralyzed in action instead of moving forward in action. And even if you're negatively motivated by the fear at first, eventually it's going to trip you up. And so I think really part of it is having a quality relationship with yourself, right? Having the confidence to be able to know that even if this isn't perfect, even if I fail, I can fail up, or I can try again, and that's okay. I also think too, when it comes to community and facilitating groups and working with people or communities or organizations, especially in leadership teams, having opportunities for people to collaborate and to get stuff wrong. I recently, during COVID and during kind of the stay-at-home time, I've been reading a lot of cookbooks, which has been kind of interesting to see these formulas, or go back to that word template, and to kind of see how things are, but then in my own practice of cooking, do some experimentation and try things that maybe I wouldn't have been confident in if I didn't kind of understand maybe the science behind it, or the reason why certain flavors go well together. But having that knowledge, and then having that confidence that I can try something new, and it's okay if it's not great, because I've learned something in the process, and allowing myself to be open to the experience of learning has really helped me. And it's also really shaped how I help other people as well, is knowing that it's okay to learn from a mistake. That's kind of the best way to learn.
Yeah, that's great. I think a lot of people get stuck in that space of I'm not gonna try because I don't want to fail.
Yeah.
They don't come out of that. So I mean, you mentioned something really important, which is also being able to take care of yourself and being able to live the values that you want your clients to live. So can you talk about times in your life where maybe things were not going as successfully as you'd like, and then you were able to be empowered for success? And what did that journey look like to help you bounce back from failures and things like that?
Yeah, that's another really good question. I think so. One of the philosophies that I'm teaching and coaching on is this idea of that we have these 4 core relationships. So we have relationship with self, we have relationship with other people, we have relationships with organizations or affiliations, and we also have like a spiritual connection, or something that sort of helps us feel connected to the universe, or gives us a sense of awe. And I know for me, when my 4 core, when I'm not actively pursuing relationships in all of those 4 different areas, my life feels out of balance, and I feel like I have a lot less control. And I think that part of empowerment is always having a sense of choice, or having a sense of control, because if I have options, I can choose my own ending. I can choose where I want to go and what I want to do, or make a pivot if I need to. I can make change, or feel empowered to make change if I have options. And so having those 4 core relationships and pursuing more closeness within those relationships, whether it's with specific people, whether it's my own relationship with self and my confidence, or how I feel about how I look or how I present or how I'm interacting, or even organizations, right? Am I pulling my weight at work? Am I having a positive relationship with my religious affiliation or organizations? Am I doing things for my community that I think are important? And then that spiritual component, am I sort of fulfilling my destiny? Am I having an impact on the world bigger than myself? Am I leaving that legacy? And pursuing activities in each one of those 4 core relationships, I think, is really what lends balance to people's lives. And it helps us kind of recognize that we're part of an ecosystem, right? We're not just sort of little islands living alone, having our own little fiefdom in life. We are part of a network. We're part of relationships. As you can see behind me, I'm very into plants, and the idea of having other living things in my life that I care for and am cared for by is really important to me. So that I sort of live out that philosophy in both my personal and professional life.
Yeah, and one of the things that I appreciate that you just brought out, Tina, was that you obviously draw, because of the diversity of your experiences and your education and also your experience, you draw on various theories and bring them together. So it's not just theories, it's practice, because we're working with people, right? So I appreciate that 4 corners. One of the approaches that Salinger Coaching Solutions has done is that we have focused on helping organizations and the people who make up organizations get into what I am calling the empowerment zone. You've probably heard of people being in the flow or being in the zone. And for me, when they are in the zone, the empowerment zone, it means that they're able to follow their passion, live with purpose, and persevere through big challenges and changes. So I kind of focus on the 3 Ps, which again are passions, purpose, and perseverance. So can you speak a little bit about what your passions and purpose are? And how having those sort of have grounded you and centered you in a way that's driven you to be the best version of yourself, even when facing challenging times?
Yeah, I think my 2 big passions are plants and people. Speaking of the P's,
More Ps.
those are my P's, plants and people. And like I was mentioning before, the idea that we are living in an ecosystem. Even as human beings, we live amongst nature, even when we live in cities. And it's important, right? We need agriculture, we need plants, we need animals, we need all these different things around us in order to keep us healthy and well. And so I feel really passionate about understanding how I'm connected to the natural world, and having that passion for plants and having plant life in my space every day is something that is really important to me. And also people and building relationships with other people. That sometimes means individual relationships. It sometimes means being a part of a group of people that have similar interests or passions or beliefs, or are working together for a common goal. Like, us meeting in school and having that common thread of being in grad school together. And then also, deepening relationships with people I care about, whether it's friendships or my partner or my family members, or even the clients that I work with, and just making sure that I honor the humanity in everybody, and give them an opportunity to share their story, and to not put my template onto other people, right? And I think that's kind of how that template idea gets promoted, is that if I'm only listening to your story through the idea of what a story should be, I'm not actually getting all the different facets that are important for your story. And so, so plants, people, those are my passions. And how do I persevere through that? I think I think quite literally, I am grounded by those things. I have literal roots with plants, and I have roots with people, and it helps kind of ground me into that bigger relationship I have with people in my life, and the creatures, great small plant flora, fauna around me.
Awesome. Yeah. So when you think of ecosystem, or when I hear you talk about ecosystem, one of the things that I think about is like, we're obviously in the middle of a public health crisis, and it's easy for crisis to throw us off throw off one system, and you throw off the whole system. And I'm thinking about when teams dysfunction, what are some elements that are in common, right? There's a lack of trust, there's a lack of commitment. People don't want to be engaged in conflict and therefore conversation. And all the creativity and collaboration falls apart because the ecosystem has fallen apart at its root and at a systematic root level when it comes to teams and things like that. So that's just something that I'm sort of picking up on in terms of this idea of ecosystem. And sort of the antidote to that is having really strong, to extend your metaphor, roots, but in relationship, right? Now, I'm going to take advantage of the fact that you also have a therapeutic background. Can you talk a little bit about, from a psychological standpoint, the importance of relationship in creating, just the importance of relationship and having relationship in terms of human development and persevering through challenges?
Yeah, that's such a good question. Thank you for asking that. And thank you for trusting my expertise. I was actually just reading something recently. It was a book about how human beings are created to be together. And it's written by the former Surgeon General of the United States. And he was talking in this book about how, like, biologically speaking, we are, neurologically speaking, we are created to live in community. And that's how we, for millennia, had been safe, right? We have our people, we have our tribe, we have our community. We live together, we collaborate together, we share resources together. And when we are alone, when we're isolated, when we are cut off from our community, we actually are less interested in finding connection, right? We become hyper vigilant. We become so hyper aware of how disconnected we are that we actually become more untrusting and more quick to judge and more quick to isolate even further, for fear that we are going to be in even more danger. So it actually is kind of counterintuitive, but when you begin to feel disconnected, you actually end up pushing people further away. And this, from this perspective, he explained it neurologically speaking. From a psychological standpoint, we also call that attachment theory, right? If we don't have positive, loving attachments in our youth and our childhood, we can grow up having poor attachments into our adulthood unless we decide to do something about that pattern. And really getting people to sort of recognize, even in our daily lives, we can become so disconnected. One of the things that the work that I'm working on in relationships is helping people realize that we now have dozens of ways to connect in an instant across the world that we've never had before in history, but we're more disconnected than ever before, right? Just because we're connecting doesn't mean that we have meaning in our relationships or meaning in our connection, and bringing back meaning into relationships is one of the things that I think is the most important thing in building back better relationships and healthy relationships and cultivating connection. So so really just recognizing when I'm feeling isolated and being self-aware enough to do that inventory and to say, oh, someone's reaching out to me, and knowing that isn't dangerous, right? If I'm already feeling isolated and I think that someone trying to reach out is danger, I have to consciously stop and rethink that. And that can take a lot of effort. And that's why a lot of people are in therapy.
Yeah. Well, I mean, it's interesting when you talk about connections and people being together. Being together doesn't necessarily mean you're working well together, right? There are, if you think about it from the perspective of leadership development or executive coaching or business coaching, right? What I offer my clients is either coaching managers on one-on-one, doing team coaching when there's a systematic issue or an organizational development issue, and doing sort of staff retreats just to build team building capacities. Because really, just because you're working together doesn't mean you're working together, right? You're physically in the space, but oftentimes you're dysfunctioning together. So that's an interesting perspective that you gave on that. So I appreciate that. So on that note, one of the things that I really focus on is working with clients who either as leaders or managers or CEOs, either they feel stuck with the team they're working on or their team itself is stuck. So what advice would you give to people who are stuck or for whatever reason feel stuck to help them get out of that state of stuckness or dysfunction?
Yeah, I think one of the best pieces of advice is to build a relationship with your own emotions. And what I mean by that is start to identify when you're feeling what you're feeling and really name it, right? It's beyond I'm happy, I'm sad, I'm angry, right? If we only have 3 words to describe how we're feeling, that's not specific enough. And so really spending time thinking about how I'm feeling. One of the most useful tools that I use in both my coaching and my therapy work is just giving people a list of emotion words and asking them to be more specific about what they're feeling and or what combinations of what they're feeling. And what I often tell people is if they're stuck, get to know your emotions so well that even the negative ones, right? Even anger, resentment, jealousy, frustration, disappointment, sadness, depression, like get to know all those emotions so well that you, like your best friend, if they stayed too long, you'd ask them to leave. It's when we don't know our emotions well enough that we put on sort of our host or hostess, mask on and want everything to be okay. And we want them to be comfortable because they're still a guest. Like get so familiar with your emotions that they no longer feel like guests. They feel like good friends. Then you can ask them to leave when they need to go.
Yeah. I also do work around working with people through their emotions and that emotions are tied to behavior, and oftentimes there's not people are not always aligned or they're not cognizant of the fact that their behavior is related to a specific emotion. And if that's the case and they're working in a team environment, if they're not in touch with their own self and why they behave in certain ways, it's not going to gel with other people who have different behaviors and they don't see that person for who they are, their narrative, right? They see the behavior, but they have no idea what the backstory is. So that's a thoughtful point you made.
Well, and I think one really fascinating thing that people don't realize that I think like you and I as facilitators and coaches and people that work with people and have specifically focused on groups, because a lot of folks in our world, when they get into mental health or they get into coaching, they don't work in groups as much as I think you and I have had the opportunity to. So people don't always know, even professional people don't always know that when we're in a group situation, if something is bothering me about the way that you are behaving, it's because you're holding up a mirror to something I don't like about myself. And it's easy for me to identify that annoying thing in you than it is for me to look in the mirror and say, oh, this is a tender spot in me that I want to work on. Mm-hmm. And a lot of miscommunication, a lot of negative assumptions, a lot of conflict is caused because people aren't willing to sort of identify or look in the mirror and figure out like, why is this really bothering me? Is this bothering me because them procrastinating touches on a value of mine that I'm not living out to my fullest? And that's usually where a lot of that stuff can get solved, is if people are willing to do the hard work of looking internally.
Yeah, it's interesting. One of the things that I talk about when I'm doing sort of organizational or business work is there's this concept of pain point, right? What is this one thing that's really making life hard for everybody, right? So I talk about going from the pain point to the brain point, which means like a thoughtful, I know it's a pun or whatever you want to call it, but a pain point, the thing that hurts because the results are not going well, to the brain point. Thinking about that, you have to, there's a certain level of awareness of yourself and of your team. There's a relationship between all of that. But I just hadn't, the language that we use is super important, right? You think of pain point as like something that's really messing up a business's, bottom line or competitive advantage, but it's still the word pain, right? It still means that there's something going on at a different level. So that's a helpful perspective, Tina. And again, one of the things that we focus on at Salinger Coaching Solutions is helping organizations, leadership, management get unstuck, as I said, especially in the context of change, right? You use the word conflict, there's tension, there's change. I mean, that's a big, it doesn't have to be an obstacle, but oftentimes, as you and I know, things that should be opportunities don't get seen that way or converted into opportunities. Yeah. So based on your background doing group facilitation and in leadership development, what advice would you give managers or leaders who are in charge of an organization that is having that moment of we're in change and I don't know what to do about it?
Yeah, I mean, I hear the word change and I get excited and tingly, but my excitement and tingles, it's chemically speaking in our brains, excitement is the same thing as anxiety. And if we're only recognizing that tingly feeling as a negative thing, right? If I'm only thinking of change as negative, I'm not going to allow that same sensation to be something positive, right? One person's workout is another person's torture. So it really, it has a lot to do with the perspective. And I think that perspective in leadership, especially when it comes to change, is really, really important. So having leadership identify what are some ways, or what are, you mentioned a minute ago, using language, what are some ways to describe change so that it's a little bit more palatable, a little bit less scary, a lot more on the excitement side than it is on the, okay, well, like, let's just suck it up and do this change because someone above us told us that we had to, kind of thing. I think that oftentimes people, and I don't know if it's like a culture thing or like a generational thing, but I've really noticed that people, it's not very cool to be enthusiastic, but enthusiasm is what gets people on board. So finding a way, even if the change isn't coming from you, even if it's not driven by a choice that you necessarily made in leadership, finding a way to have some enthusiasm behind it, I think is really important. And the way you describe it can be really helpful. And also another thing too, I think in leadership, when you get to a point when you're in a leadership situation and you're running a team, it can be really hard to sort of separate your own ego from the success of the team. But I always encourage people in leadership situations to always have a succession plan in mind. Like, who are you mentoring? Who are you training up? Who are you providing the resources so that if you get hit by a bus, your team can still be successful? And not necessarily that you want someone to replace you or compete with you, because it's not always about competition, but really identifying how can I mentor my team so that if, heaven forbid, I want to take a vacation or something in my life happens and I have to take a step back for a couple of days or a week or 2 weeks, that I can do that and I can feel confident in my team to be able to continue to move forward. And that's a lot of trust. And it really, it requires people to really think outside a competition paradigm and to think in more of a collaborative paradigm. And I think about, what we learned in school and in conflict resolution. Not every conflict can be solved through competition.
Right. Something that I'm drawing on that you said, that you mentioned, is mindset shift, right? Whether it's a mindset shift from ego or a mindset shift from if I have to compete with other companies, I have to compete internally to get the best out of my people. Because if you want to change results, you have to change relationships. If you change relationships, you have to change people. You have to change mindsets to do that. So I appreciate that insight. Did you have a follow up to that at all? Or?
No, you summarized it well. Yeah.
Good.
I'm having the best time with you. Thank you.
Good. Yeah. So my last question is just, we've covered a lot of stuff, right? We've talked about your background, your views on empowerment, and perspective on perseverance, and your sort of 4 core corners, your advice to leaders, to managers, to people, both from a leadership perspective, and then also you providing your psychological background. Do you have any final thoughts that you would like to leave with my viewers?
Yeah, I think it just goes back to keep pursuing relationships with all 4 core relationships: relationship with self, relationship with others, relationships with organizations, and your spiritual relationship. And if you're pursuing that, or at least if you know like what the healthy balance is for you, like it's not going to be 25% neatly, in a pie graph, right? There are going to be ebbs and flows in which of those relationships need to be important at different times or different parts of the story of your life. But finding whatever the balance of that is for you at this particular season in your life, and pursue those relationships, and allow the open-mindedness, or allow yourself to be in that mindset of growth, or as a constant learner. One of the cookbooks that I read over this stay-at-home time in the last few months is I read the book Salt, Fat, Acid, Heat by Tina Kocol. And I went on I totally started fangirling over her, and I took this deep dive. And one of the things that really struck me about her philosophy is, even though she's world renowned and she's amazing, and she has this cookbook and she has a Netflix show based on her work and everything, she's very successful. She considers herself to be a cook, and she doesn't call herself a chef, because in her perspective, a cook is someone who's constantly learning, who's constantly trying new things, who's constantly able to make mistakes and keep on growing. Whereas a chef sort of means that you have arrived and you are now in charge, and you have all these people doing your bidding for you. And she always wants to kind of maintain this perspective of, I'm open to new possibilities. I'm open to new cuisine. I'm open to new techniques. And I think that having that perspective, that lifelong learner perspective, while trying to pursue relationships in the 4 core that I teach on, is really it. Like if we can stay curious and we can build relationships in those 4 different areas, I think that a lot of the pain points that you were describing can be addressed pretty quickly.
All right, that's a great note to leave on. Thank you for engaging in this conversation on PEP, which is Passion, Empowerment, and Perseverance with Salinger Coaching Solutions.
Thank you for having me.
Of course.